The first lesson you learn as a field observer in the Galactic Council's research division is this: never, ever assume you understand a species based on their appearance. The second lesson? Humans will violate every single assumption you make anyway. I learned both lessons the hard way while stationed on the war-torn planet of Kythera 5, watching what should have been the most straightforward military recruitment operation in recorded history turn into something that would require 3 different departments to classify. The Razok Empire had conquered half the Outer Rim using a simple but effective strategy. Take the young of conquered species, train them as shock troops, and deploy them against their own kind. Psychological warfare at its most brutal. Cubs who'd never known anything but military conditioning made terrifyingly effective soldiers against populations who saw familiar faces behind enemy lines. It worked on everybody, until they tried it on the Tharkans. Sitting in my observation pod 3 kilometers above the battlefield, I watched General Corvus deploy his latest batch of conscripted Tharkan cubs against the rebel stronghold. 53 younglings, each one barely past their second molting, armed with plasma rifles and combat stimulants. Their spotted fur had already begun darkening with the aggression enhancers, their natural predator instincts amplified beyond reason. "This should be over within the hour," transmitted my research partner Kix, his 6 eyes tracking the cubs' advance through our shared feed. "Standard Razok protocol. The rebels won't fire on their own young, the cubs will breach the defenses, and another world falls to the Empire." I adjusted my recording array and settled in to document yet another predictable conquest. The cubs moved with lethal precision across the scarred landscape, their enhanced reflexes allowing them to dodge defensive fire while closing distance on the rebel positions. That's when everything went sideways. A single voice cut through the battlefield's electronic noise, transmitted on every frequency simultaneously. Clear, calm, and utterly human. "Kiro, Zana, Brix, Tella, Voss," the voice said, speaking each name with careful pronunciation. "It's time to come home." The effect was immediate and impossible. The cubs, mid-charge across open terrain, simply stopped. Not slowed down, not hesitated. Stopped dead in their tracks like someone had hit a universal pause button. "What in the 7 moons was that?" Kix transmitted, his confusion rippling through our mental link. I checked my instruments frantically. "Unknown transmission origin. The signal appears to be coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously." The voice continued, still maddeningly calm, despite addressing what were essentially drug-enhanced child soldiers in the middle of active combat. "I know you're confused right now. I know the chemicals in your system are telling you to fight, to hunt, to kill. But that's not who you are." General Corvus's command frequency exploded with panicked chatter as his perfectly conditioned weapons began lowering their rifles. Several cubs actually sat down in the middle of the battlefield, their expressions shifting from feral aggression to something disturbingly close to confusion. "Impossible," Corvus snarled over the communication array. "They've been conditioned since infancy. No external stimulus should override their training." The human voice chuckled, and the sound somehow carried warmth even through military-grade encryption. "General, you clearly don't understand how children work. Any children. From any species." "Who is this?" Corvus demanded. "Identify yourself immediately." "Oh, I'm nobody special," the voice replied with obvious amusement. "Just someone who spent the last 6 months learning every cub's name, their favorite foods, their sleeping patterns, and exactly what lullabies their parents used to sing before you murdered them." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of 53 Tharkan cubs dropping their weapons. I'll admit it. Even from my safe distance, that casual mention of lullabies sent chills down my spinal column. There was something profoundly unsettling about the way this human had just weaponized nostalgia. "Kiro," the voice said, addressing one cub specifically. "You always loved those purple fruits your mother packed in your lunch. The ones that grew wild behind your settlement's main hall." A small figure in combat armor looked up, his young face visible through his helmet's visor. The confusion there was heartbreaking. "Zana, your father used to tell you stories about the great hunters of old before bedtime. Remember? The ones where the hero always protected the weak instead of hurting them?" Another cub, this one female, actually began crying. The combat stimulants in her system should have made that physiologically impossible. How? I transmitted to Kix. How does this human have access to that level of personal information? I don't know, he replied. But look at the biometric readings. The cub's aggression markers are dropping below baseline. Their stress hormones are normalizing. It's like the conditioning is just dissolving. The voice continued its impossible roll call, speaking to each cub individually, sharing memories that should have been lost forever when their worlds burned. Gardens they'd played in, games they'd invented, pets they'd loved, songs their families had sung. General Corvus tried everything. He activated emergency combat protocols, flooded the cubs' systems with additional stimulants, even deployed sonic weapons designed to disrupt cognitive function. Nothing worked. The human voice cut through it all like it was background noise. "Bricks, you were always the curious one," the voice said to a cub who was methodically removing his combat gear piece by piece. "You asked so many questions your teachers couldn't keep up. What happened to that curiosity? What happened to wanting to understand instead of just destroy?" "This is impossible," Kix transmitted. "You can't reverse years of psychological conditioning with words. It goes against everything we know about neural manipulation." "Maybe," I replied, watching the cubs continue their peaceful rebellion. "We don't know as much as we thought." The rebel forces, initially confused by the unexpected ceasefire, began emerging from their defensive positions. But instead of attacking the now defenseless cubs, they did something that made even less sense. They started approaching with open arms. "Kiro?" a middle-aged Tharkan female called out, her voice breaking with emotion. "Kiro, is that really you?" The cub in question looked up, his drug-hazed eyes trying to focus. Aunt Neela?" That's when I realized the scope of what the human had actually accomplished. This wasn't random psychological manipulation. This was a precisely planned reunion. "How many survivors?" I wondered aloud. "According to my database," Kix replied after a moment of scanning, "there shouldn't be any. The Razok bombardment was reported as total population elimination." "Yet there they are," I observed, watching families embrace children they'd thought were dead. "Which means either the Razok filed inaccurate reports or someone evacuated survivors before the attack," Kix finished. "Someone who knew it was coming." The human voice spoke again, and this time there was steel beneath the warmth. "General Corvus, I believe your tactical situation has changed somewhat." Indeed it had. The cubs were no longer advancing on the rebel position. Instead, they were being gathered into the protective embrace of families who were supposed to be corpses. The perfectly planned psychological assault had become an impromptu family reunion. "Impossible," Corvus repeated, but his voice carried less conviction now. "The intelligence reports confirmed total casualties." "Intelligence reports can be wrong," the human replied cheerfully. "Especially when someone with a very particular set of skills decides to evacuate entire populations under the cover of orbital bombardment. Tricky business that. Takes precise timing and absolutely no regard for personal safety." I felt my worldview shifting again. This human hadn't just interfered with the battle. They'd been planning this for months, possibly years. The level of preparation required was staggering. "You saved them," General Corvus said, and for the first time his voice carried something other than arrogance. "You saved the families." "I saved everyone I could," the voice replied simply, "including those cubs you turned into weapons. They're still children, General. They still deserve a chance to grow up knowing love instead of war." "Sentimental nonsense," Corvus snarled, but his heart wasn't in it. "They're conditioned soldiers. They can't just switch back to being normal children." "Can't they?" the human asked. "Tella, sweetheart, can you remember your mother's soup recipe?" A small female cub, still wearing partial combat armor, looked up with sudden brightness in her eyes. "The yellow roots and the spices that made your nose tickle. That's the one." She actually giggled. A combat-conditioned child soldier giggled at a memory of soup. "The conditioning process relies on suppressing positive emotional associations," I transmitted to Kix, my understanding crystallizing. "But if those associations are reactivated systematically..." The military programming becomes secondary to the original personality, he finished. Brilliant. Impossible, but brilliant. The tactical situation on the ground had shifted completely. What should have been a massacre had become a refugee camp, as more survivors emerged from hidden shelters throughout the region. Families were reuniting with cubs they'd thought lost forever, while the Razok ground forces found themselves facing not terrified civilians, but a united community with nothing left to lose. "This changes everything," General Corvus transmitted, his voice showing the first cracks of uncertainty I'd ever heard from a Razok commander. "It certainly does," the human agreed. "Your psychological warfare tactics just became useless against anyone with a decent memory and a working communication system." That's when the full implications hit me. This wasn't just about saving one group of cubs or liberating one planet. This human had just demonstrated a reproducible method for reversing military conditioning. The Razok Empire's entire strategic advantage had just evaporated. "Who are you?" I found myself asking over the open channel, my professional curiosity overwhelming my better judgment. "Dr. Kate Wells," came the reply, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Child psychologist, trauma specialist, and apparently, amateur military strategist." A psychologist. A human psychologist had just revolutionized interstellar warfare using nothing but empathy and meticulous record-keeping. "Dr. Wells," General Corvus said, his voice now carrying grudging respect. "You realize what you've done here?" "Helped some kids find their way home?" she replied innocently. "You've ended the war." The silence that followed stretched across the battlefield like a held breath. Cubs continued reuniting with families. Rebels and civilians worked together to establish temporary shelters, and somewhere in the distance, a group of children who'd been turned into weapons were learning how to play again. "Well," Dr. Wells said finally, "I suppose that's a nice bonus." The aftermath was even more bewildering than the initial intervention. Within minutes, Razok dropships began landing across the battlefield, but instead of deploying reinforcements, they were evacuating their own forces. General Corvus himself appeared via holographic projection, his scaled features showing an emotion I'd never seen on a Razok face before: defeat. "Dr. Wells," he said formally, "I'm ordering a full withdrawal from this system." "Just like that?" she asked, sounding genuinely surprised. "No final desperate assault? No scorched earth tactics? How disappointingly reasonable of you." The general's mandibles clicked in what I recognized as rueful amusement. "Doctor, in the past hour, you've invalidated 2 centuries of Razok military doctrine. Every conscripted child soldier in our forces now represents a potential liability rather than an asset." "Good," Dr. Wells replied without hesitation. "Children should be liabilities in war. They should be protected, not weaponized." I watched through my instruments as more dropships arrived, but these were different. Medical vessels, transport ships designed for civilian evacuation, even what appeared to be mobile educational facilities. The Razok weren't just retreating, they were completely restructuring their approach. "Kix," I transmitted urgently. "Are you recording all of this?" "Every impossible second," he replied. "The psychological profiles alone will revolutionize our understanding of species interaction dynamics." On the ground, something equally unprecedented was happening. The reunited Tharkan families weren't celebrating their victory or planning revenge against their former oppressors. Instead, they were organizing. Medical stations appeared as if from nowhere. Temporary schools were established in abandoned buildings, and someone had actually started preparing communal meals using portable cooking equipment. Where did all this infrastructure come from? I wondered aloud. Dr. Wells answered as if she'd heard my private transmission. "Oh, that would be the supply drops I arranged 3 months ago. Emergency shelters, medical supplies, educational materials, comfort items. You know, the boring stuff that actually helps people rebuild their lives." General Corvus's projection flickered, with what might have been admiration. "You planned for the aftermath before the battle even began." "Of course I did," she replied matter-of-factly. "What's the point of freeing children from military conditioning if they don't have anywhere safe to recover?" That's when I realized the true scope of her operation. This wasn't just battlefield psychology. It was comprehensive post-conflict reconstruction planned and executed by a single human with apparently unlimited foresight. "Doctor," came a new voice over the communication array. "This is Admiral Thex of the Galactic Council Peacekeeping Fleet. We received your request for long-term colonization support 6 months ago." 6 months ago. She'd been planning this reunion 6 months before it happened. "Ah, excellent timing, Admiral," Dr. Wells said cheerfully. "The families are ready for relocation to the new settlement sites. I trust the agricultural specialists are standing by?" "All arranged according to your specifications," the Admiral confirmed. "Though I have to ask, how did you know this would work?" "Simple," she replied. "Children love their families more than they fear authority. Always have, always will, across every species I've studied. You just have to remind them what love feels like." Below us, the cubs were helping their families pack supplies and load transport vessels. The same children who'd been advancing as weapons an hour ago were now arguing about who got to carry which stuffed animal to their new homes. "The transformation is complete," I observed to Kix. "Soldiers to children in under 2 hours." "Not soldiers to children," he corrected. "They were always children. Someone just helped them remember." As the evacuation proceeded with impossible efficiency, I found myself reconsidering everything I thought I knew about warfare, psychology, and the fundamental nature of conflict resolution. Dr. Wells had just ended an interstellar war, using nothing but careful observation, meticulous planning, and the radical belief that love was stronger than conditioning. 2 weeks later, I received the transmission that would change everything I thought I understood about human influence on galactic politics. "Observer Yex," came Dr. Wells's voice through my personal communication array. "I need a favor." I nearly dropped my datapad. Direct contact from research subjects was strictly prohibited under Council regulations, but something about her tone suggested this wasn't a social call. "Dr. Wells," I replied carefully. "I'm not authorized for direct interaction with—" "The Razok are using modified versions of my technique on 3 other systems," she interrupted. "Badly. Children are dying because they're trying to reverse engineer emotional manipulation without understanding the underlying psychology." My secondary heart skipped a beat. "That's unfortunate, but hardly my concern." "It becomes your concern when those children start calling for their families in languages the Razok don't speak." The implications hit me like a plasma burst. If the Razok were attempting crude copies of her methods on different species, they'd need translators, cultural specialists, and psychological profiles that only the research division possessed. "They've been accessing our databases," I realized aloud. "For 6 days now," she confirmed. "Downloading everything we have on 37 different species family structures, linguistic patterns, and emotional development cycles." Kix's urgent transmission buzzed through my consciousness. "Security breach confirmed. Multiple unauthorized access attempts to xenological archives." "How did she know before we did?" I forwarded the question to Dr. Wells, who chuckled in that unsettling way humans had when they were 3 steps ahead of everyone else. "Because I set up monitoring protocols on my original data package," she explained. "Anyone trying to access information about emotional conditioning triggers in non-human species would ping my systems automatically." "You've been spying on the Razok Empire," I accused. "I've been protecting children," she corrected firmly. "There's a significant difference." Through my observation array, I could see transport ships dropping out of hyperspace around Kithara 5. But these weren't Council vessels or Razok military craft. The energy signatures were completely unfamiliar. "Dr. Wells," I said slowly, "what exactly are those ships?" "Volunteers," she replied simply. "Turns out, when you broadcast the method for freeing conditioned child soldiers across 47 star systems, people tend to pay attention." My instruments went haywire as I tried to count the incoming vessels. Hundreds of them, representing dozens of species I'd never seen cooperating before. Medical ships from the Centauri Collective, transport vessels bearing Altarian merchant markings, even what appeared to be Andromedan research platforms. "This is unprecedented," Kix transmitted, his excitement rippling through our shared link. Multi-species coalition formation in response to a single individual's initiative. The statistical probability is essentially zero. Yet here we are, I replied, watching the impossible fleet organize itself into efficient operational groups without any apparent central command structure. Dr. Wells's voice crackled through the communication array again, but now she was addressing the entire fleet simultaneously. Okay, people, you know the drill. Team Alpha takes the Vega system, Team Beta handles the outer rim conflicts, Team Gamma gets the tricky one near the galactic core. The tricky one? Someone asked over the open channel. Crystalline-based species, she replied. Their emotional structures don't map to mammalian patterns, so we'll need modified approach vectors. Dr. Xylith, your team ready for that challenge? An entirely new voice, speaking in harmonics that made my translation software struggle, responded with what I could only interpret as enthusiasm. Ready, Dr. Wells. The harmonic resonance calculations are complete. I found myself gaping at my instruments. She had organized specialists for species-specific psychological intervention across multiple star systems, coordinated their arrival at a single point, and was now deploying them like some kind of therapeutic strike force. How? I transmitted to her directly. How what? She replied, though I could hear the amusement in her voice. How do you coordinate this level of interstellar cooperation without any official authority? Oh, that's easy, she said. I asked nicely. Before I could process that response, alarms started screaming throughout my observation pod. Kix's panic flooded through our mental link as his instruments detected massive energy signatures approaching from the edge of the system. Razok Battle Fleet, he transmitted. Flagship and 17 support vessels, combat configuration, ETA 12 minutes. The volunteer fleet's response was immediate and completely baffling. Instead of scattering or preparing for battle, they formed up in perfect defensive formation around the planet. Medical ships positioned themselves behind heavier transport vessels, while the research platforms began broadcasting on multiple frequencies simultaneously. Dr. Wells, came a guttural voice I recognized as General Corvus, you are in violation of 17 different interstellar treaties. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences. General, she replied with maddening calm, you're absolutely right. I am violating treaties, specifically the ones that let you steal children and turn them into weapons. Those conscription protocols are legally sanctioned under the Outer Rim Annexation Accords. We're legally sanctioned, Dr. Wells corrected. But funny thing about laws, General, they tend to change when enough people decide they're morally reprehensible. That's when I noticed something extraordinary happening throughout the system. Ships were appearing everywhere, dropping out of hyperspace in groups of 3 or 4, their transponder signals showing registry from virtually every member species of the Galactic Council. Observer Yex, came a transmission from an official council frequency. This is Director Coln of the Judicial Branch. Please confirm the nature of the gathering in your observation area. I stared at my readings in disbelief. Director, I'm showing approximately 3,000 vessels from at least 60 different species, all apparently here in support of Dr. Wells's Child Liberation Initiative. 3,000, the director repeated slowly. And climbing, I added, watching more ships materialize by the minute. General Corvus's tactical situation had shifted from advantageous to impossible in the span of 15 minutes. His battle fleet, while formidable, was now outnumbered roughly 200 to 1 by ships representing a significant portion of galactic civilization. This is madness, he transmitted, but his voice carried uncertainty rather than anger. This is democracy, Dr. Wells replied cheerfully. Turns out, most sapient beings don't approve of using children as weapons. Who could have predicted such a radical position? The sarcasm in her tone could have melted hull plating, but it was her next words that truly changed everything. General, I'm transmitting the locations of every child conscription facility in Razok space. Your choice. Help us liberate them, or explain to 3,000 ships worth of angry parents why you think child soldiers are a good idea. The silence that followed stretched across multiple star systems as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about one planet or one group of cubs anymore. Dr. Wells had somehow orchestrated a galaxy-wide intervention in the Razok Empire's core military strategy. You've united half the known galaxy against us, General Corvus said finally. I've united half the known galaxy for something, she corrected. There's a difference. You just happen to be on the wrong side of it. Through my instruments, I watched as Razok ships throughout their territory began receiving the same transmission. Child conscription facility locations, detailed intelligence about psychological conditioning programs, and most damaging of all, the names and home planets of every child currently in their military pipeline. The database breach, I realized. You didn't just monitor their access to our files, you mapped their entire operation. 6 months of careful observation, Dr. Wells confirmed. Amazing what you can learn when you pay attention to supply manifests, transport schedules, and communication patterns. General Corvus's fleet had moved into a defensive posture, but they weren't preparing to attack. Instead, they seemed to be protecting themselves from their own empire as reports flooded in from across Razok space. Facility after facility was being surrounded by volunteer fleets, their conscripted children being offered safe passage to family reunification centers. This is the end of everything we've built, General Corvus transmitted, his voice carrying defeat. No, Dr. Wells replied gently. This is the beginning of something better. Your species are excellent engineers, brilliant strategists, and natural leaders. You just got distracted by the idea that might makes right. And now? Now you get to find out what you can accomplish when you use those talents to protect children instead of exploiting them. The transformation began immediately. Razok commanders throughout their territory started cooperating with liberation efforts, providing intelligence about facility locations, security protocols, and most importantly, the personal information needed to reconnect children with their families. Observer Yex, Dr. Wells said, her voice now carrying exhaustion beneath the determination. I need you to document everything. This needs to be recorded properly. For the council archives? I asked. For the children, she replied. So they'll know that someone cared enough to remember their names. As I watched the greatest spontaneous humanitarian effort in galactic history unfold around me, I found myself understanding something fundamental about humans that all our research had missed. They didn't just adopt individuals or small groups. When the stakes were high enough, they could adopt entire civilizations, transforming enemies into allies through the simple but radical act of caring about outcomes for the most vulnerable. 3 months later, the last Razok conscription facility had been closed. The Empire had restructured itself into a confederation focused on education and infrastructure development. Former child soldiers were attending schools built with Razok engineering expertise and funded by the coalition that had formed around Dr. Wells's initiative. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a human psychologist was probably planning her next impossible intervention, armed with nothing but careful observation, meticulous planning, and the unshakable belief that every child deserved to grow up knowing love instead of war. The galaxy would never be the same. And that, I was beginning to understand, was exactly the point. But Dr. Wells wasn't finished. Not even close. 7 hours after the last Razok facility had surrendered, my communication array crackled with an encrypted transmission that made my exoskeleton tingle with anticipation. Observer Yex, came her familiar voice, though now it carried a weariness that hadn't been there before. I need to show you something. Can you redirect your observation platform to the Kepler Nebula? That's outside my assigned research zone, I replied, though my curiosity was already overriding my better judgment. It's also where the real work begins, she said simply. Kix's excitement buzzed through our shared link as we recalibrated our instruments for long-range observation. The Kepler Nebula was notorious for its sensor-dampening properties, making it a perfect hiding place for operations that preferred to remain unseen. What we found there defied every assumption I'd made about the scale of human planning. By the 7 moons, Kix transmitted, his shock rippling through our connection. How many facilities are there? Spread throughout the nebula's concealing gases were hundreds of installations, their modular construction suggesting rapid deployment but permanent intention. Medical centers, educational facilities, recreational areas, and what appeared to be residential complexes designed for multiple species' physiological needs. Welcome to Hope Station, Dr. Wells announced, her voice now coming from within the nebula itself. Population: approximately 57,000 former child soldiers and counting. 57,000. The number hit me like a plasma charge to the cognitive centers. "This is impossible," I transmitted. "The logistics alone would require months of preparation, massive resource allocation, specialized construction teams." 14 months of preparation, actually," she interrupted. "And you'd be surprised how many species are willing to contribute resources when you explain that you're building safe spaces for traumatized children." Through our enhanced scanners, I could see the impossible bustle of activity throughout the installations. Children of dozens of species were engaged in what looked like normal childhood activities, playing games, attending classes, creating art, forming friendships across species barriers that had existed for millennia. "Dr. Wells," came a new voice over the communication array, speaking in the crystalline harmonics of a vegan council member. "This is Counselor Rath. I'm receiving reports that you've established an unauthorized colony in neutral space." "Unauthorized by whom?" she replied with that dangerous cheerfulness that I was learning to associate with imminent bureaucratic demolition. "By the Galactic Council's Colonial Authority, the Nebula Resource, Management Division, and approximately 17 different territorial jurisdiction committees," Counselor Rath listed with obvious irritation. "Interesting," Dr. Wells mused. "And which of those authorities has jurisdiction over refugee children fleeing military conscription?" The pause that followed suggested Counselor Rath was consulting legal databases in real time. "That would be the Humanitarian Affairs Division, the Child Protection Services Bureau, and the Interspecies Welfare Commission." "Excellent," she replied brightly. "All three of those departments issued joint approval for this facility 6 months ago. I can transmit the documentation if you'd like to review it." 6 months ago. Again. This human had been operating on a timeline that made galactic bureaucracy look positively swift by comparison. "The paperwork is extensive," Counselor Rath admitted after a moment, "and appears to be completely in order." "Government efficiency," Dr. Wells said with audible satisfaction. "Amazing what you can accomplish when you file the right forms with the right departments at the right time." But the legal maneuvering was just the surface layer. As my instruments continued their deep scan of Hope Station, I began to understand the true scope of what she had constructed. "These aren't temporary refugee facilities," I realized aloud. "These are permanent settlements designed for long-term development." "Of course they are," Dr. Wells replied. "You can't just rescue children from military conditioning and send them back to the societies that failed to protect them in the first place. They need new homes, new communities, new possibilities." The residential complexes were marvels of interspecies accommodation. Atmospheric processors maintained separate environmental zones for species with different respiratory needs. Gravity generators created varied zones for beings adapted to different planetary conditions. Even the food production facilities were designed to synthesize nutritionally appropriate meals for dozens of different digestive systems. "The resource requirements must be astronomical," Kix transmitted, his engineering mind boggling at the logistics. "Not really, Doctor," Wells said, apparently monitoring our private communications with typical human disregard for privacy protocols. "When you're dealing with children who've been trained as soldiers, they already know how to work together efficiently, maintain equipment, and follow complex operational procedures. You just redirect those skills toward construction, agriculture, and community management instead of warfare." Through the scanner feeds, I watched groups of former child soldiers working together on construction projects, their military precision now applied to building playgrounds and schools instead of bunkers and weapons platforms. The efficiency was remarkable, but what struck me more was the obvious joy in their activities. "They're happy," I observed. "They're children," Dr. Wells replied simply. "Give children safety, purpose, and the freedom to make friends, and happiness tends to follow naturally." That's when the next impossible thing happened. My sensors detected new arrivals in the nebula, but these weren't supply ships or construction vessels. These were passenger transports, hundreds of them, carrying what appeared to be entire family units. "Dr. Wells," I said carefully, "those appear to be civilian populations, non-military adults accompanying children. Parents, grandparents, siblings, aunts, uncles, family friends," she confirmed. "Turns out, when you create safe spaces for children, their families tend to want to join them," Funny how that works. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a rescue operation or even a refugee resettlement program. This was the birth of entirely new societies, built around the principle that children's welfare came first, and everything else developed from that foundation. You're not just freeing child soldiers, I realized. You're creating the next generation of galactic civilization. Now you're beginning to understand, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. These children have seen the worst that different species can do to each other. But they've also experienced cooperation, protection, and care from people who didn't share their biology, their culture, or their language. They'll grow up expecting that level of cooperation, Kix added, his understanding crystallizing. They'll demand it from whatever societies they eventually create or join. Exactly, Dr. Wells confirmed. You can't traumatize a generation into believing that might makes right, and then expect them to accept cooperative solutions. But you can show children that protection and care are possible across species lines, and they'll spend their lives making sure those possibilities become realities. As I watched the bustling activity throughout Hope Station, I began to see it not as a collection of refugee facilities, but as a prototype for something unprecedented in galactic history. A truly multi-species society built from the ground up around shared values instead of shared biology. The Razok transformation was just the beginning, I transmitted to Keeks. The beginning of what? He asked. I looked at the children of dozens of species playing together in zero-gravity recreational areas, attending integrated educational programs, and forming friendships that would reshape interstellar relations for generations to come. The beginning of everything, I replied.